Thanks to everyone for tuning in, and thanks to Oliver Treinert and all of my former colleagues at CSS for inviting me to speak today, and for organizing the talk. I will dive right in, so we have as much time as possible for questions. Today, I'd like to make 3 key points. First, that US-China competition is here to stay, so we need to start thinking about what it means for us. Second, that US-China competition is damaging many or even most of the key pillars of the rules-based international order. And third, that Europe is especially affected by US-China competition and needs to or should act more aggressively to defend its interests and values. Right, so US-China competition is here to stay. Why is this? Maybe the most obvious reason is we see a shifting power dynamic, and you can see this in the graph at the bottom of the screen on the left, which is depicts percentage of world GDP. You can see over the last 30 years, the US's share has gradually declined and China's has dramatically increased. Put simply, China's rising, the US is in relative decline. Now, historically speaking, it's not inevitable that a declining power and a rising power will engage in long-term competition. Of course, most famous example probably is the US and Great Britain at the turn of the 20th century became allies rather than competed. However, I think in the case of US and China, we see a very different dynamic developing. One of the reasons for that is you see 2 radically different systems confronting each other. The US is, of course, it's a democracy. As we're seeing right now, it's definitely an imperfect democracy, but it has a different way of thinking about the international system. It has different interests and different values. China, meanwhile, I think contrary to what a lot of people expected 20, 25 years ago, as it has become more deeply integrated with the international economic system, with the international system overall, it has become more repressive, more authoritarian. So you have 2 very different systems confronting one another. Interestingly, as these 2 very different systems confront one another, there are some shared characteristics. Both are highly nationalistic and have universalist ambitions. Right now, we're seeing a particularly unpleasant variation of US nationalism, quite unilateralist, suspicious of interacting with outsiders. The US has, of course, always, since its inception, had universalist ambitions. From the beginning, the US conceived of itself as a city upon a hill, an example to other nations. China, meanwhile, in China, we see a version of nationalism that is rooted in resentment, historical sense of grievance, directed largely at foreign countries for repressing China, for dividing China that stretches all the way back to the middle of the 19th century. China has its own version of universalism. I won't try to pronounce the Chinese phrase, but the English translation is all under heaven, and this refers to a conception of the international system as interconnected, with China kind of as the pivot point at the center. In both cases, we're seeing a significant influence of domestic politics on foreign policy. In the US, the Trump administration is preparing to run its 2020 re-election campaign, with one of the pillars of that campaign being demonizing China, blaming China for the horrifically high death rate we see in the United States from the pandemic, trying to depict Joe Biden, President Trump's opponent in the election, depicting Joe Biden as being weak on China. And the upshot of all this is we now see both countries pursuing grand strategies that are premised on competition with each other. Second point I'd like to make is that US-China competition is damaging many or even most of the key pillars of the rules-based international order. We are seeing I think we're seeing a significant degree of damage from the US stepping back from its kind of traditional role of leadership, or at least partially stepping back from its traditional role of leadership in the international system. I think we can all agree that the US has been an imperfect hegemon, but the current system that we're all worried is dissolving, the current system would not have been possible post-1945 without US leadership. And I think it's safe to say that, at least in its current incarnation, it is very difficult to conceive of a rules-based order without substantial US leadership. Now, China's trying to fill the vacuum in various ways, but I think it's safe to say that this is something we shouldn't necessarily welcome. I think that China's role in the pandemic is a kind of a case in point. At first, China's response to the pandemic looked pretty good, giving lots of money to the WHO. It was sending supplies and aid all over the world. But now, as we get more information, its response is looking increasingly concerning. There are reports from multiple intelligence agencies that China pressured the WHO to delay declaring the crisis a pandemic, which of course affected how other countries responded. There are reports that even as it was pressuring the WHO not to declare the crisis a pandemic, was racing around the world buying up supplies because it recognized the scope of what it was facing. And it has been pressuring countries, and in the US it's been pressuring individual states to pass legislation to explicitly praise China's response. US-China competition is causing significant damage to international institutions and agreements. We're seeing this in the WTO, for example, which is partially paralyzed. The dispute resolution in the WTO is not functioning. The US has single-handedly stopped its functioning. The US actions are counterproductive right now, there's no question. But the US is also making a good point in a very bad way, which is that as it is currently designed, the WTO is not equipped to manage a system, an economic system like China's, where the governments and industry and banking are all so deeply interconnected that it's impossible to discern the dividing lines. We're seeing this in the UN in terms of the international human rights regime. The US, on one hand, is partially withdrawing, is showing a lot less in the way of leadership, is actually creating parallel structures. It has created the Commission on Unalienable Rights to reorient US human rights policy on more kind of socially conservative lines. China, meanwhile, is taking a much more active role in the UN on human rights questions, but it's doing so with a very distinct strategy in mind. It's playing a more active role to reorient how we conceive of human rights away from individual rights and individual liberty, and more along the lines of economic developments, which of course has there's a very specific reason for that. Also China, with help from Russia and a few other countries, is using its increasing influence to cut those parts of the UN human rights budget which it finds runs counter to Chinese interests. And then finally, US-China competition is fueling a growing tendency to link geopolitics and trade relations. Now, of course, mercantilism is nothing new in the history of international relations, but after 1945, at least in the West, we did a pretty good job of separating political relationships from trade relations. That line is now dividing is now dissolving in large part because of how the US and China are competing with one another and dealing with other countries. So my third and final point, what does US-China competition mean for Europe? Well, as you can see in the graph here, Europe is in blue, China's in red, the US is in green. Europe is kind of stuck both geographically and metaphorically between these two competing superpowers. It is deeply interconnected with both economically, increasingly politically, now with China as well. And obviously it's still deeply interlinked with the US in terms of security relationships. So what does this mean for Europe? Well, I would argue that Europe should basically do three things. First, it should continue to defend those parts of the rules-based international order that matter most to Europe and that can potentially be saved. This means institutions like the WTO, for example. I talked a couple minutes ago about the problems that the WTO is facing, but the WTO is still a massively important institution, especially for European countries. This morning, I took another look at the numbers, and by one estimate, Switzerland, for example, is $18 billion per year wealthier because of its participation in the WTO. Where I live and work now in the Netherlands is $27 billion better off because of the WTO. Both China and the US reap massive benefits from the existence of a rules-based trading order, and in spite of their current disagreements, both will have an interest in seeing some version of the WTO survive. NATO is another good example of an institution that Europeans should fight for. As we all know, NATO has been facing some problems in recent years, especially in terms of its relationship with the United States. But NATO is still really it's still the only game in town when it comes to European security needs, and especially as the economic side of the coronavirus pandemic begins to bite, and a lot of European countries cut their defense spending rather than increase it, as was previously planned. NATO is, in the short to medium term, it's the most important aspect. It's really the pillar of European security. And by the way, the US, though it's been a difficult partner, is and will continue to be interested in NATO. And I can talk more about that if anyone has questions. UN human rights. I talked a few minutes ago about the problems facing the international human rights regime. The upside is many countries are still very interested in some version of this international human rights regime that's been created over the last few decades. And there are good reasons for that, especially when it comes to European countries. It aligns with European values, and there's a growing amount of evidence that both at the national level and international level, a strong human rights regime is actually good economically, makes sense economically, and boosts economic growth. The second thing that Europe should be doing is, even as it defends key aspects of the rules-based international order, it should start thinking creatively about alternative forms of multilateralism. And here, again, the WTO offers an instructive example. Because the dispute resolution system of the WTO is currently paralyzed, because the US won't let it function, a group of countries with Europe in the lead, Switzerland is also part, China is also part, they have formed a short-term organization called the Multi-Party Interim Arbitration Agreement. And this is basically a short-term dispute resolution system modeled along WTO lines that is, it's not as good as a fully functioning WTO, but it is still a lot better than nothing. These are the types of creative solutions that increasingly we'll probably need to think about. And then the final point I would make is that Europeans need to begin thinking more strategically about how to preserve their interests and values. What does this mean concretely? First, don't give up on the US. It will be a more inconsistent partner in the future. I don't think there's any question about that. But there's still quite a bit of overlap between US interests and values and European interests and values. What about China? The whole notion of somehow isolating China is very unrealistic. So Europe needs to and will want to work with China moving forward. But what does that mean? It needs to be clear-eyed about the nature of the Chinese regime. It needs to be patient and stubborn and pragmatic, and think long-term about what it wants internationally, just like the Chinese do. And this leads to the final thing I want to say, which is Europeans need to get in the habit about thinking about grand strategy. That's deep, that very much runs counter to how Europeans have traditionally thought about their place in the world, but it is absolutely essential, especially in light of US-China competition and the fact that Europe is stuck in between them. This is going to mean getting much more serious about European strategic autonomy, regardless of the budget cuts that we're going to see over the next couple of years. And it means being more proactive about partnering with other like-minded democratic middle powers. Obviously, that means Europe, but it also means countries like Canada, means countries like Australia, South Korea, Japan, New Zealand. Alone, these countries can't necessarily do all that much, but in coalition, they can actually start to make some noise.